thinking about something this week that I wanted to share because it's been really on my mind a lot, and um, I think it might bless you. I know it's really been encouraging and convicting for me, um, something to think about. And so it comes from Joshua. So I actually joined a Bible study last week. The first time I've ever actually like done an actual Bible study. I've like studied the Bible and I've taken classes about Bible classes and things like that, but joined like a community Bible study like at a church for like the first time. That is different than like a small group. Um, anyway, and so we're going through the book of Joshua in this Bible study, and one of the things that really stood out to me right as we're entering into reading this is, when you look at the context of Joshua, Joshua was one of the two spies who went into the promised land under the orders of Moses, and Joshua and Caleb were the only two out of 12 who gave a good report of the land. And this happens in Exodus, so some context for who Joshua is. So basically, 12 spies are sent in, 2 come back with a good report, 10 come back full of doubt, full of fear, and basically inspire the entire assembly of Israel to rebel against the Lord, because the Lord had told them to go take this land. And Joshua and Caleb are the only ones who stood up and said, no, like, God gave us this land, let's have faith and let's trust him and let's go and not be afraid of the fact that there's giants and that they're well armed. Like, God is our source and he is going to give us victory. And the people were so full of doubt and fear that they actually wanted to kill Joshua and Caleb. And what ended up happening was, because of everyone else's disobedience, the entire assembly of Israel had to wander the desert for 40 years before they could take the promised land. And Joshua and Caleb were the only people left from that generation who got to see the promised land. So think about this for a second. Egypt, they were born into slavery in Egypt. God saved them. But the only people who had been in Egypt who got to actually see and actually enter the promised land were Joshua and Caleb, because they obeyed and trusted God. But they still had to experience the consequence of everyone else's sin. They didn't sin in that context. They didn't do anything deserving of the consequence that everyone got. That makes sense. They're not perfect, obviously, but in this specific case, the reason why the wandering happened was because of the lack of faith. Joshua and Caleb had faith. Joshua and Caleb were trying to get them to obey and follow the Lord, and the Israelites didn't. But Joshua and Caleb still had to experience that 40-year consequence, the delay in receiving the promised land. And it got me thinking, because it started bringing to mind times in my life when I've experienced the consequences of someone else's sin. Again, not that like, I'm perfect or you're perfect, because I'm sure you've experienced this too, right? But it was a situation where genuinely, like, you did the right thing and someone else did the wrong thing. And because they did the wrong thing, you experienced a consequence. This shows up a lot, can show up in family relationships, especially family dynamics, right? Because one person making a bad choice, making a sinful choice, has ripple effects and repercussions on everyone, even if everyone else is making the right choices. Or it can, depending on the situation. And so it just got me thinking about this, of like, how we have a choice in that moment. We don't get to choose whether or not we experience the consequence sometimes. Sometimes we're kind of stuck with the situation. We don't get to choose our circumstances. There have been multiple times where, in my life, where someone else made a bad choice, made a sinful choice, and it impacted me. And I had to carry consequences and experience consequences for something I didn't do. And I'm sure you've experienced this too, because, this is something that happens in life. And when that happens, we have a choice. We can get angry and bitter and mad that happened. And there's a level to which we're justified in that. Like, we didn't deserve that consequence. I'm thinking about some of the times in my life, I didn't deserve the consequence that I experienced. I didn't deserve to have to walk through that, in the sense that I wasn't the one who made the bad choice. I shouldn't have had to experience that. So I could be mad about that. I could get bitter about that and blame the other person who did make the choice, whose fault it was. Or I can trust that God is going to work it out. I can trust that God sees my heart, and God saw me. And God saw that even though that person made a sinful choice and they sinned, and now I'm experiencing it. When you experience loss, there's the natural process of grief, of grieving that loss. Grieving the fact that that's 40 years of their lives they could have spent in peace or in conquest and victory instead of wandering the desert, right? And I look back at my own life, and I want to encourage you to look back at your own life. What areas where you have experienced consequences that you didn't bring on yourself? It was because of someone else. You get to make the choice, and you may have chosen to be bitter in that moment, and that's what you chose in that moment because that was the best choice you could make in that moment based on your experience and what you've been through. But you have a choice right now to decide, are you going to be bitter and angry and therefore heap more consequences on yourself? Because bitterness is a sin.
Choosing to be bitter
is a sin. And especially when we're walking through challenging seasons, bitterness prolongs that. Bitterness prolongs the victory. It pushes the victory away. So the longer you stay in bitterness, the longer you are going to stay in the crap. The longer you're going to stay in the hard thing. The longer life is going to suck. And there's times when life sucks. Or you can choose, you know what? I'm going to trust God. This shouldn't have happened to me. And you know what? That's true. I shouldn't be experiencing this. I did nothing to deserve this. I did nothing to invite this into my life. Someone else's sin is what caused this to happen. I'm having to bear the consequences of that. But I'm going to trust God that He sees my heart, that He sees my faithfulness in the midst of this. And I'm going to trust Him and choose to forgive the person whose fault it is. I'm going to choose to forgive whoever and whatever about the situation that I need to. I'm going to choose to walk in forgiveness. I'm going to choose to walk in grace. And I am going to allow the Lord to use this to refine my heart and refine my perspective so that I can stand before Him with a pure heart and say, I trust you, and I trusted you even in that. And when we do that, God gives us this perspective, and we get to see eventually. And it might take some time. It's not like immediately you get this vision, but as you choose to trust the Lord, despite circumstances that maybe you don't have control over and shouldn't be happening, but when you choose to trust Him through that, He will bless you. And you're going to come out on the other side, and you're going to look back, and you're going to get to see, oh my word, Lord, look what you did. Look what you did in my heart. How you made it grow me closer to you and more like you. Look at what you did in my life. Because see, God promises that in Romans, He promises that He makes all things work together for the good for those who are called according to His purpose, for those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. So if we choose to love Him and trust Him through the crap, He will make it all work out for our good. And He'll let us see that. He'll let us see the good. Usually in hindsight. But sometimes even in the moment, He'll give us those glimmers of here's what I'm doing here. Here's what I'm doing. I'm working in this person's heart. Here's what I'm doing. I'm refining you. I'm stripping away things that are not in alignment with my heart. He gives you those glimmers in the moment sometimes, and He definitely gives you some hindsight as you're out of it. You can look back and see, oh my gosh, look what you did, Lord. And so that's something that's just really been on my heart this week as I've been studying Joshua in this study, because he's an example of that. He's this example of someone who had to bear the consequences for someone else's sin. he did the right thing. He should have been able to enter the land, but because everyone else sinned, was wrapped up in the consequence of the assembly. And that happens. That happens in life. It's not like, oh, it's something that used to happen. That still happens. It still happens today. The sin of one member of a family impacts the entire family. The sin of one person in a church impacts the entire church. We are impacted by other people's sin. And sometimes there's some really significant consequences that we end up carrying because of that. And it's not a punishment for us, but it is an opportunity. We get to, and when we see it as that opportunity of, oh, I get to learn to trust the Lord more and rely on Him more, He uses that to refine us. So that is just something that I've been thinking about this week. I hope that was encouraging to you. I want to encourage you that if you made it all the way this far, to really take some time to think about that. Like, think about, maybe you're in the midst of that right now where you're in a really hard situation that's not your fault. You can, and you'd be very justified in being a victim and staying in victim mode of like, this isn't my fault, and this sucks, and I'm mad at the person whose fault it is, and you know, there's a sense, like, you are justified in that. It doesn't mean that you're wrong. But when you choose to stay in that victim mode, you're only getting bitter, you're only prolonging your agony, and you're going to miss out on what God wants to do in your life. So making the powerful decision of, I'm going to choose to forgive. I'm going to choose to invite the Lord into this and say, Lord, I trust you. Please show me what you want to teach me in this moment. And following Him in that. And starting to take personal responsibility for your own life. Again, you can't control other people. You can't control the circumstances necessarily, but you can take personal responsibility for your own life and your own heart and your own actions. And so when you choose to do that, you get to step into peace and joy and experience what it is that the Lord wants to show you in your life. So I want to encourage you to take the time to just a second. I want to encourage you to take the time to do that. Hold on one second. I want to encourage you to take the time to think about that this week and spend some time with the Lord and ask Him to show you where it is in your heart that you need to release bitterness and step into trust.